Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to take a look at some of the different ways that we can change voxels within our game during gameplay in Crayta. So the reason that we're looking into this is because changing the terrain of your game during gameplay can be a really fun way to create a dynamic and immersive world, and also give opportunities for changing the state of play at any given moment. If you're in something like a head-to-head race or a team deathmatch or whatever it is, changing what's going on in the terrain can be really fun. Or even if it's more like a tycoon kind of game and you want to grow crops and then show the different seasons, then adding snow to all of your voxels can be a fun thing to do. And you can do that using some of the methods I talk about during this tutorial. So to start with, I've created a little voxel mesh here. So this is its own voxel mesh called Aging Grass. And what I want this to do is essentially spring into life. I want this soil to suddenly burst into, or to go through the stages of grass would be a really nice thing to do, having it age over time. And so one of the simplest ways to do this, or to change the voxel mesh during runtime, would be to change it to a different mesh completely. So I've got this identical voxel mesh here. Let me just turn grid snap on. I've got this identical voxel mesh here called Meadowgrass. It's exactly the same size. It's actually a duplicate of the mesh and then just filled something differently. And what I can do in code is create a counter that will turn this voxel mesh into this voxel mesh. And we could do it at the moment just using the entity editor with this drop down. And this is essentially what I'm going to be replicating in code. It's just changing what voxel mesh is going on. So let's get into it. So I've got this aging grass script attached to it. And in here, I'm going to create a timer. So that needs a property that I expose to the entity editor for how long that timer is going to last. So timer length. And the type is a number. And this is the number of seconds that will be required before the voxel mesh changes. During the init function, I need to set up a couple of variables. Self.elapsed is 0. And then during my onTick function, which happens every frame, I'm going to use the delta time to increase my elapsed so that it's tracking how many seconds it's been around. So self.elapsed equals self.elapsed plus delta time. So that's increasing self.elapsed by the number of seconds that have passed since the last frame. And so gradually it will tick up in seconds. And then I'm going to check if self.elapsed, check that against the timer length, self.properties.timer length. And if it's greater than the timer length, reset self.elapsed. And now comes the fun part. I can do self get entity, which will get hold of the voxel mesh that this script is attached to. And I can do dot mesh equals, and that's where I can change the voxel mesh. And now I need a reference to that voxel mesh to change it into. So I'm going to go back up to the properties here, make sure there's a comma at the end of that line. And then I'm going to put name equals new voxel mesh. And the type will be a voxel mesh asset. In parentheses. Now, it's not going to update this because there's an error in my code. So let's just comment that out for a sec. You can see if I comment that out, there's no errors in my code now. So now the entity editor over here is updated, and we can see that this property has now appeared so that I can change it. And because I set it to voxel mesh asset, I can use this drop down to choose what voxel mesh asset that needs to be. So the thing I want to change it into is this meadowgrass voxel mesh. And so let's uncomment that line of code now, and then self get entity dot mesh, and I'm going to set it to this new voxel mesh here. So self dot properties dot new voxel mesh. So once the timer, so increase this elapsed by amount of time since the last frame. If the elapsed is greater than the length of time that we've specified here, then reset that timer and change the mesh. We don't even need to reset the timer, but it's good practice. And then change the mesh to the new voxel mesh. Now let's just set our timer to 5 seconds and press F5 to run. So I'll go over here to this voxel mesh, and there we go. After 5 seconds, it transforms into a beautiful tiny meadow. And that's just changing the voxel mesh itself at runtime. There are some more fun things we can do in our coding to do with our voxel meshes. And so let's have a look at those. For example, with this voxel mesh, what if I don't want it all to change at once? Or what if I want to add voxels to it? Or what if I want to pick out specific voxels and change them into something else? This is where we can use some of our other voxel mesh function calls in Crayta. And let's have a little bit of an exploration into those now. So rather than changing the entire mesh to something else, what I might want to do is let's create a new property and let's put a new voxel type. Let's just call it voxel type. And the type of property this is going to be a voxel asset. Notice it doesn't have the voxel mesh. It doesn't have the voxel mesh. Now, why is that giving me an error? Expected near type. Oh, comma. Okay, it's not voxel mesh asset, it's voxel asset. So now, once my timer runs out, what if I just change one voxel on my voxel mesh? I can do that. I can go self get entity. And then this is a function call. So :set voxel. And if we look at what it's asking us for here, it's asking us for a position, which is a vector, and a voxel asset, which we have in our properties. And it says change a single voxel in world space. So let's click on that and let's use that. We need a position. So vector.new. And I'm going to change just the block in the corner, 0, 0, 25. And I'm going to use the voxel asset voxel type there. Self.properties.voxel type. Okay. So we need to set that voxel type before it'll work. But I just wanted to talk about this position real quick. So I've given it a position here, and that is relative to the voxel mesh itself. It's not relative to the game world. So if you look, this voxel mesh is at position 336,567,0. And that refers to this point here, which you'll see on this little gizmo down here. And so the position I've written here, 0025, refers to the position relative to that point there. So 00 is the X and Y. So it's still at this point here. And then 25 on that final number there moves it up the Z axis. So vertically 25. So that will give us that point there. So it's referring to that voxel there. And so it will set that voxel to whatever I put into voxel type. And I've just changed this to a lowercase v. So before I try and break it, let's change that. And I'm just going to select the meadow one, just like I did before. So it's going to just change this block here to the meadow. Let's make sure that works. So go over here. After 5 seconds, we can see it's transformed just one voxel on that voxel mesh into a meadow. So a next generation of this might be, instead of having one voxel type, if we put a comma here and do container equals quote mark array, we can have multiple voxel types. So now my voxel type is an array with one element that's still grass meadow. And I'm just going to set this to 6 so that we've got 6 possible voxel types. And let's go in here. Let's put in grass. And the first one needs to be scrub, and then short, and then grass meadow, grass wild, grass dry. And the final one, I will reset it to soil. So it's almost like the life cycle of a patch of grass. Now I've got that array of multiple types of grass. And they're all stored in that one property there. I probably should rename that to voxel types, but if I do that, I'll lose my array now. So voxel type. In my init function, I need self.voxel type index, which will be a number that we use to track through these. And then on the onTick function, once we've got our timer and it's finished, what I'll do is I'll increment this voxel type index by 1, so it'll count through these. And then if it's greater than the number there are in the array, I'll reset it to 1. So let's start it at 0 because that's essentially going to be soil. So let's increase it here. So self.voxel type index equals self.voxel type index plus 1. So that will set it to 1 to start with, and then the next time the timer runs out, it'll set it to 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7. So we want to catch it before it does that. So we're going to put an if self.voxel type index is greater than hash self.voxel type, which is the number of elements within that table. Then let's put an end before we forget. We need to just reset it back to 1. Yeah, self.voxel type index. We should reset it to 0 because we add 1 to it. Oh no, we need to reset it to 1. Yeah, okay. So if it gets to 7, then reset it to 1. Now, you could do that using modulus maths. I've chosen to do a conditional statement just because it's easier to explain than going through what modulus and all that stuff is. But you can totally go and do that if you want. That's another probably more optimal way of doing it. Okay, so we have a voxel type index. So now instead of setting it to this, which will actually break at the moment because that's referring to an array, I just need to put a square bracket here and then do self.voxel type index and then end square bracket. So this will count through this array and set that same voxel to this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. And let's see if that works. So, oh, it's still set to 5 seconds. Let's speed that up just before we go on. Let's put it at 1.5 seconds. And if I come over here and watch it, I'm getting an error. Length of field voxel type is a nil value. Self.properties.voxel type, like that. Okay. There we go. So we can see now it's counting up through the different types of grass that I had in my array. So we've got that one little patch of grass aging quite quickly. But, you know, if you coupled that with the time of day changing and even use the UTC's time, so getting hold of the actual time, you could change the grass along with the seasons, which might be quite a fun thing to do. Now, another way we can change voxels, rather than setting an individual voxel, we can actually do self get entity set voxel box. And this gives us an opportunity to essentially do the same sort of thing as using the shape cube tool here. So like we can with this cube, where we can add voxels, or even if we want to change voxels, we can do that in our editor. We can do that in code using this self set voxel box. And that's essentially doing the same sort of thing as that. And what we just need to do here is, again, supply it a position to start with. So I'm actually going to set it to 100, 100, 100, and then put comma. And we can either give it a half size, which is the extent, so like the half the width of the cube that we want, or we can do a cuboid, and we'll come on to that in a minute. So to start with, I'll do the half size, so just one number, and then the voxel type. So let's get hold of that bit of code that I wrote there and put it at the end there, and then end the bracket. And let's see what happens when I do that. Ta-da! So we can see we're now drawing boxes of voxels at runtime in code, or changing them if they're already there. So it's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to do, is to change what voxels are going on in your game world during gameplay. And notice it doesn't error or break it if the voxels are already there. It just changes what voxels are there, or it can add them if it needs to. So that's really exciting. Now, I did promise I would look into the cuboid part. So instead of this number 50, we can actually create a different, it doesn't have to be a cube, it can be cuboid, which means it's still a 6-sided shape, but it's got different length or width or height, whereas that's always got the same width, length, and height are all the same for that number. So if we do vector.new here instead and supply 3 numbers, let's say 50, 100, let's put 50, 100. Let's do 500, 100, 100. So now, rather than just one number, I'm supplying a vector in the middle of this function call here. And if I run that, we can see it's adding a cuboid rather than just a straight cube. So we can define our shape using a second vector there. And you can do the same sort of thing using spheres. I won't go into that, but it's essentially set voxel sphere, and it's the same as using this sphere tool here. So just like we can do that, you can do that in code using set voxel sphere. And that's kind of the crux of changing the voxel types in your voxel meshes at runtime. There's a few different ways of doing it there. And so let's look at a couple of applications of this. So I've taken the gun template, and I've just modified the gun script a little bit. I've added a decoration voxel to it. And if I search for where I've used that, it's in the process bullet function. Within here, I'm getting hold of the position that I just shot my gun at. So that will get the position of the voxel you just fired at. And then I'm setting the voxel at that position to whatever voxel I've set in here. So I've set it to line wallpaper 70s. This other code here where it says if self.properties.paint position, what that's doing is essentially I can check this paint box, and if I check it on, then it gets the voxel at the position of the direction of the ray plus 12.5. So essentially the next voxel on from where we just hit, just because if I check paint on, it will replace the voxel. If I turn paint off, so it doesn't run this line of code here, that will add a voxel on top. Okay, so let's look at that in action. I've got this blunderbuss here, and I've set up a nice bathroom to do some interior decorating. And I can come in here and I can just shoot wallpaper, where once it was a really nice green lino tile type thing on the wall. I can now, I can try my hand at decorating. There we go. Beautiful. It's a beautiful bathroom. My work here is done. So maybe you want to make a decoration game. Another way I thought that we could play around with changing or adding voxels is using a bridge gun. So here I'm building a bridge by shooting voxels across some water. I can get to the desert island. Yeah. So there's a couple of different ways you might want to. I mean, I could also paint my way across there in 70s wallpaper if I wanted to. There's a couple of different ways that you might want to play around with that. It's really cool to change the mesh and to play around with kind of using different voxels in races and changing the terrain during a multiplayer game. Can add a lot to your game world. And like I said before, you can even put seasons in, especially now there's all these winter voxels. You can add those to the game. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing how people change voxels in runtime and play around with this stuff and what happens to the games in Crayta.